most satisfying thing you've ever told your entitled family member? While my mother was literally in labor with me, my grandmother on my dad's side announced, "I'm cutting you both out of my life. My other son's wife is rich and can support my retirement. Your wife is a lazy food stamp collector whose hair disgusts me." Dad's mouth dropped before his jaw clenched with anger. "Get the hell out if you're gonna be racist to my wife." My grandmother backed up like she was offended. "It's not racist. It's the truth. Your brother's wife is the best thing that's happened to us." She looked at my dad like he was a naive child when he said that finding real love was the best thing that happened to him. "Good luck on your real love. Don't come crawling back when she's framed you for a theft you didn't do." She left the delivery room, already booking flight tickets off her other daughter-in-law's credit card. I wasn't there to see it, but my grandmother's actions lit a fire inside my parents. Mom threw herself into teaching when I got a little older, and Dad picked up extra shifts at the warehouse. When I was 7, Mom and Dad had saved enough to start an after-school program. Mom tutored while Dad taught life skills like fixing cars or how to DIY insulate your walls. Soon, 50 kids had started showing up. Meanwhile, my grandmother was living with my uncle and his wife Annette, going on holidays, spending her money, buying new cars just because she could. But there was something neither of the families knew. Turns out Annette had been in that delivery room when I was born. She'd stood silently in the doorway, and hearing her mother-in-law call a newborn baby a disgrace shifted something inside her. That's when she heard about my dad's success. By now, the program had a second location. My parents were profiting enough to move to a house with a pool and take vacations where I'd get my own hotel room. That's when Annette made her move. "Market's been rough lately. We're losing a lot," she casually said during a smaller than usual family dinner. Grandma's eyes instantly went wide. Soon, Annette took money out of my grandmother's card so it declined. Then grandmother's king-sized bed got replaced with a single. Then came the big announcement. Annette showed up to lunch crying. "The lawyers say my trust fund might be frozen for years. We're going to lose everything." My grandmother's reaction was immediate. "Are you seriously telling me you're going broke?" Annette cried and nodded like it was true. Over the next few weeks, grandmother's fancy clothes were sold to pay off stock losses, her $25 coffee was replaced with instant, and Annette and Richie even moved into an apartment to make the loss of money look real. That's when my grandmother finally snapped. "I think I need some space from you two while you figure things out financially. It's just so stressful for me." Just like that, she stopped coming to dinners, started ignoring Annette's calls, all over money that was never actually gone. That's when she remembered she had another son. I was 15 when she showed up at our door. Dad was at work, but Mom was home. I'll never forget my grandmother's face when she saw our house. The mental math was visible. The pool, the 2 cars, my MacBook on the counter. "I've been thinking about family lately," she said, clutching her knockoff designer bag. "I realize I may have been hasty in the past." Mom, because she's better than anyone deserves, invited her in for coffee. My grandmother sat in our kitchen, looking at the photos from our vacations, the awards from the after-school program, the life we'd built without her. "I always knew you two would make something of yourselves," she lied. "I just wanted to give you space to grow." She started crying about being abandoned by both sons, how lonely she was, how family should stick together. Then came the ask. "I just need a little help getting back on my feet. Maybe I could stay in your guest room? Just temporarily." Dad came home during this performance. He listened. Then he spoke very quietly. "You called my baby a disgrace," in the delivery room, while my wife was still bleeding. "I was upset. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," he snapped. "And you know how Anity is supposedly going broke?" Grandmother's ears perked up. "How do you know that?" she asked. My dad just smirked. "How do you know that?" "Brothers talk, Mom," he finally said. He walked around visibly enjoying her panic. "You do know that Annette's trust fund was never frozen." Grandmother's jaw dropped. "What do you mean?" she asked, scared to hear the answer. "Annette is a smart woman, Mom. She knows you only loved her money, so she put you to the test." My grandmother turned white. "That's not possible." But even she wasn't believing her own words. "Annette can buy you a Bentley at the snap of a finger. But now she never will. And you'll never see a cent off me either. Now get out of my house." Grandmother turned desperate. "Please, I'm your mother. You can't just—" "You're right. I can't just abandon family." Dad stood up. "But I can give you exactly what you gave us, which is nothing." He kicked her out. And here comes the best part. When grandmother called my uncle from our driveway, sobbing that we'd rejected her, he interrupted her. "You know, Mom, my marriage has been better since you left. Annette and I aren't fighting, and we enjoy cheap TV dinners without you nagging us over $100 wine bottles. You're not welcome back." Her jaw dropped. She came back inside begging, "Please, I'll go homeless if you don't take me in." Mom and Dad looked at each other, knowing what she was saying was true. Their eyes held each other for what felt like forever, while grandmother stood there shaking between them. Mom's face showed that teacher look she gets when a kid at the program needs help, but also did something wrong. Dad's jaw stayed tight, but his eyes softened just a tiny bit when he looked at Mom. Finally, Mom spoke real quiet but firm that they needed to talk about this alone first. Grandmother's crying got louder and she grabbed Dad's arm, begging them not to leave her on the street like some homeless person. Dad pulled his arm away and walked to the front door, opening it wide. He told her to wait in her car while they figured things out. She started wailing about being his mother, but Dad just pointed to the door. Grandmother shuffled out looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, and we all moved to the living room window to watch. She sat in her beat-up sedan that looked nothing like the fancy cars she used to drive with Uncle and Annette. Mom started pacing around the kitchen, running her hands through her hair over and over. She kept stopping at the counter, then starting to walk again like she couldn't decide what to do. Dad followed her with his eyes and reminded her how grandmother called her lazy and worthless when I was being born. Mom's hands clenched, but she kept pacing, and I could see her fighting with herself. Dad said grandmother chose money over us and only came back because the money was gone. Mom stopped walking and stared at the floor, breathing hard. I finally spoke up from where I'd been standing by the stairs. I reminded them that our after-school program had 50 families who trusted us. What would happen if word got out that we let Dad's mother go homeless? Mom stopped pacing completely and looked at me with this surprised expression. She admitted she'd been thinking the same thing about our reputation. Dad grabbed his phone and said they should call Uncle first to see if he'd changed his mind. Uncle answered on the second ring, and his voice was cold as ice when Dad explained the situation. Uncle said his marriage with Annette had never been better since grandmother left. He wasn't going to sacrifice his wife's happiness for someone who only loved her money. Dad put it on speaker, and we heard Annette's voice in the background asking who it was. She took the phone and dropped a huge surprise on us. Annette said she'd pay for a motel room for a few nights, but only through someone else. She wouldn't have any direct contact with grandmother at all. She suggested we find a social worker to handle everything so there'd be no family drama. Dad thanked her and hung up, then walked outside to where grandmother still sat in her car. We watched from the window as he leaned down to talk through her window. She started wailing loud enough that we could hear it inside, but Dad cut her off with sharp hand movements. He was telling her she couldn't stay here, but they'd figure something out for tonight. Grandmother's face got red and she was yelling something about abandonment. Dad yelled back that she abandoned us first when I was literally being born. He turned and walked back inside, leaving her sitting there with her mouth open. Mom got on her laptop and started searching for cheap motels in the area. She found one about 10 minutes away that had decent reviews and wasn't too expensive. Dad called and booked a room for 3 nights using Mom's credit card. He gave strict instructions that no room charges could be added to the bill. The desk clerk seemed confused but agreed to note it in their system. Dad went back out and handed grandmother the room key card through her window. She took it without saying thanks and drove away, muttering something we couldn't hear. That night was rough for all of us. I kept tossing and turning, thinking about everything that happened. Around midnight, I heard Mom and Dad talking in hushed voices from their room down the hall. Mom kept saying we couldn't become like grandmother by choosing money and reputation over family. Dad's voice was harder to hear, but he sounded frustrated and tired. Mom said even toxic family was still family, and we had to find a balance. Their voices went on for at least an hour before finally going quiet. The next morning, Mom was already up making calls when I came down for breakfast. She had the phone book open to government services and was writing notes on a yellow pad. After 3 transfers, she got connected with someone at County Social Services. The woman on the phone said her name was Stephanie McCarthy and she specialized in elder care resources. Mom explained our situation without going into all the ugly history. Stephanie sounded understanding and said these family situations were more common than people thought. She agreed to meet with us that afternoon to discuss housing assistance options. Mom thanked her and hung up, looking relieved to have some professional help. Dad came down looking tired with dark circles under his eyes. He poured coffee and sat at the table staring at nothing while Mom filled him in on the social worker meeting. I grabbed some cereal and watched my parents looking older than they'd ever looked before. Around noon, our neighbor sent Mom a text that made her phone buzz on the counter. Mom picked it up and her face went pale as she read it. She showed Dad the message about grandmother's beat-up car sitting on our street since dawn with someone sleeping inside. Mom's hands started shaking and she had to put the phone down before she dropped it. Dad grabbed his keys and headed for the door without saying anything. I watched from the window as he walked down the street toward the old sedan parked 3 houses down. He knocked on the window and grandmother sat up looking confused and disheveled. They talked for a minute before Dad started waving his arms around looking mad. He came back inside and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. Grandmother hadn't used any of the 3 motel nights we paid for because she wanted to save them for when things got really bad. Dad kept pacing around the kitchen saying this was exactly the kind of manipulation she always pulled. Mom reminded him we couldn't force her to use the room if she didn't want to. We still had to meet with Stephanie that afternoon, so Mom made sandwiches nobody really ate. The drive to the county office felt longer than usual with everyone staying quiet. Stephanie's office had posters about elder care and a big desk covered in folders. She explained that senior housing had waiting lists between 6 months and a full year long. The emergency shelters were full of people with mental health issues and weren't safe for older women. She pulled out a brochure for a rooming house on Maple Street that had an opening right now. The place needed $800 for deposit and first month, but it was clean and had a manager on site. Dad's face got red when he heard the price and he started to argue. Mom kept looking at the pictures of the small rooms with shared bathrooms and common kitchen. Stephanie said this was actually one of the better options available for someone in grandmother's situation. We thanked her and left with the brochure and some applications for benefits. That evening, Mom and Dad had their biggest fight in years about what to do next. Dad kept saying his mother made her choices when she picked money over family 15 years ago. Mom worried about what kind of example they were setting by letting family go homeless. Their voices got louder and louder until I couldn't take it anymore. Maybe Uncle would pay half if we ask him the right way, I said from the doorway. Both my parents stopped and looked at me like they forgot I was home. Dad called Uncle right then and put him on speaker, so we could all hear. Uncle listened to the whole situation, and then went quiet for a long time. He finally said he'd pay half, but only if the money went straight to the rooming house. Annette got on the phone and added that grandmother had to agree to stay away except for real emergencies. She wanted everything in writing through Stephanie so there couldn't be any confusion later. Uncle said grandmother had already burned through their goodwill, and this was the absolute last thing they'd do. 2 days passed pretty quietly while Stephanie worked on the paperwork for the rooming house arrangement. Then around 4:30 on Thursday, my phone started blowing up with texts from kids at the program. Grandmother had shown up during pickup time and was making a huge scene in the parking lot. Mom and Dad rushed over while I stayed home, trying not to panic about what was happening. When they got there, grandmother was telling a group of parents how her own family refused to help her. Several parents looked really uncomfortable, and one mother pulled Mom aside to ask if everything was okay. Dad had to physically guide grandmother away from the crowd while everyone watched and whispered. Some of the kids were staring, and I knew this would be all over school tomorrow. That night, the phone rang 3 different times with parents calling about the scene at pickup. 2 families said they were thinking about pulling their kids out if there was family drama affecting the program. Mom spent an hour on each call trying to explain without giving too many personal details away. The 3rd family was more understanding, but still expressed concerns about the environment at the program. Dad looked defeated as he listened to Mom trying to save their reputation over the phone. The next morning, Mom was making coffee when the phone rang again before 7 o'clock. Jay Swift from the local paper introduced himself and said he'd heard about an incident at the after-school program. He asked if we wanted to make a statement about what happened with the elderly woman in the parking lot. Mom's face went white, and she started stammering about needing to call him back later. Dad grabbed the phone and almost started telling Jay everything about grandmother's past behavior and why she deserved this. I stepped between them and took the phone myself before Dad said something we'd regret. Our family is working through some challenges while maintaining healthy boundaries, I told Jay calmly. He seemed satisfied with that, and even mentioned his own mother-in-law causing similar problems for his family. Mom relaxed a little when Jay said he understood family situations could be complicated and personal. He thanked us for the statement and said he'd just run a small mention without going into details. After he hung up, we all stood in the kitchen feeling exhausted, even though the day just started. Stephanie called an hour later saying she'd scheduled a meeting with everyone, including grandmother, for that afternoon. The meeting was supposed to lay out all the boundaries and expectations going forward with the rooming house. We got to the conference room at 2 o'clock and waited in uncomfortable silence. Grandmother showed up at 3:15 claiming she got lost finding the building. Dad pointed out she'd lived in this town for 40 years and the county building hadn't moved. Grandmother just shrugged and sat down without apologizing for wasting everyone's time waiting for her. Stephanie pulled out a folder and started spreading papers across the table, while grandmother watched with narrowed eyes. The papers had numbers and lists that made grandmother lean forward even though she was trying to look uninterested. Dad drummed his fingers on the table as Stephanie organized everything into neat piles. Mom sat with her hands folded, watching grandmother's face change as she realized this wasn't going to be simple. Stephanie cleared her throat and started explaining options while grandmother kept interrupting with complaints about how hard she'd had it. She brought up raising Dad and Uncle alone after their father left, which made Dad's face turn red. He slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump, and reminded her that her parents had helped her plenty. Grandmother tried to argue, but Dad kept going about how she chose money over family, not the other way around. His voice got louder as he listed all the times she'd picked wealth over relationships. Stephanie raised her hand to calm things down and went back to explaining the housing options available. She showed grandmother pictures of a rooming house that had an opening with shared bathrooms and a communal kitchen. The place needed 3 months paid up front, which would give grandmother time to apply for benefits and maybe find work. Grandmother's face twisted when Stephanie mentioned working, and she started ranting about being too old for jobs. Stephanie just pointed to the other option, which was a homeless shelter with bunk beds, and no privacy at all. Grandmother went quiet real fast looking at those shelter photos with people sleeping on cots lined up in rows. That's when Stephanie's phone rang and she answered, putting it on speaker without asking anyone first. Annette's voice came through clear, saying she'd been listening to the updates from Stephanie all along. She said she'd pay for the rooming house, but only if grandmother agreed to one more condition that wasn't negotiable. Grandmother had to attend weekly budgeting classes at the senior center starting immediately with no exceptions allowed. Grandmother's face went from pale to bright red as she realized Annette had been controlling this whole thing from behind the scenes. She opened her mouth to refuse, but then looked at the shelter photos again and closed it without saying anything. Stephanie wrote up the agreement right there with all the conditions while we all watched grandmother sign with shaking hands. 3 days later, we drove to the rooming house with grandmother's stuff packed in garbage bags and 2 old suitcases. The building looked decent from outside, but inside smelled like cabbage and cleaning products mixed together. Grandmother complained the whole way up the stairs about her hip and how the railing was loose. Her room was small with a single bed against one wall and a dresser that had seen better days. She started whining about the shared bathroom down the hall and how the window faced a brick wall. Mom kept biting her lip to stop herself from saying something while Dad just kept bringing bags up. He reminded his mother that Annette had given her a king-sized bed that she'd left behind by choice. Grandmother went silent for a minute, then started complaining about the thin mattress and scratchy sheets instead. We left her there unpacking and muttering about ungrateful children while other residents watched from their doorways. The first week went by without any contact, which felt weird but also kind of peaceful for everyone. Then Dad's phone started ringing at work with grandmother calling during his shifts to complain about everything. She called about the food and the noise and the other residents and the temperature of her room. His supervisor pulled him aside after the 5th call in 2 days, warning him about personal calls during work hours. Dad came home stressed and snapping at everyone, which wasn't like him at all before this whole mess started. I started having trouble focusing at the school with all the drama making my grades slip for the first time ever. Logan Becker, my counselor, noticed me spacing out during class and asked me to stay after one day. He sat across from me and asked what was going on without pushing too hard for details. I told him about the family situation, and he helped me see that adult problems weren't my responsibility to fix. He gave me some techniques for dealing with stress, like writing in a journal and taking walks when things got overwhelming. He reminded me that I couldn't control what adults did, but I could control how I responded to it. Meanwhile, grandmother was causing problems at the rooming house by taking extra food from the communal kitchen at night. Other residents started complaining when their labeled groceries went missing, and tensions were building up fast. The manager called Stephanie saying grandmother had been caught red-handed with someone else's yogurt and sandwich in her room. Stephanie had to drive over and mediate, while grandmother insisted she'd bought those items herself, even though they had someone else's name on them. The manager warned that one more violation would mean eviction, and grandmother would have to find somewhere else to live. 2 weeks after moving in, Officer Dion showed up at our door at 10 at night with grandmother in his patrol car. She'd been found trying to sleep on a park bench after getting kicked out of the rooming house for 3 days. Grandmother admitted through tears that another resident had accused her of stealing money from their room during the night. The rooming house had a zero-tolerance policy for theft, so they'd made her leave while they investigated what really happened. Officer Dion said he couldn't keep taking her to the park, and we needed to figure something out fast. Dad called Stephanie even though it was late, and she started making calls to figure out what had actually happened. The investigation showed grandmother hadn't stolen any money, but she'd been telling sob stories to other residents about her rich family abandoning her. She was trying to get sympathy money from people who barely had anything themselves, which caused the false accusation. The resident who accused her felt bad, but also angry about being manipulated into almost giving grandmother $20. The rooming house agreed to let her return, but with a final warning about manipulating other residents for money or food. Stephanie had to explain to grandmother that this was her last chance, and any more issues meant she'd be out permanently. Mom couldn't sleep that night and decided we needed to help somehow, without enabling grandmother's behavior or breaking our boundaries. She came up with a plan to drop off groceries once a week, but with strict conditions attached to it. Grandmother had to agree not to make any comments about our family or ask for anything beyond what we brought. Mom wrote up the rules and had Stephanie deliver them so there wouldn't be any face-to-face confrontation about it. The first delivery day, Mom packed basic groceries like bread and peanut butter and drove to the rooming house alone. She left the bags at the front desk with grandmother's name on them and didn't go up to the room. Grandmother came down and took the bags without saying anything, which was probably the first time she'd ever stayed quiet. The second week, Jay Swift from the local paper called about doing a piece on elder care and family boundaries. He'd heard about our situation through the community grapevine and wanted to interview us about navigating difficult family relationships. Mom and Dad agreed to talk, but only if he kept us anonymous in the article. Jay spent 3 hours at our kitchen table taking notes while Mom explained how we were trying to help without enabling bad behavior. The article came out that Sunday with the headline, "When Love Means Setting Limits," and used examples that anyone who knew us would recognize immediately. My phone blew up with texts from classmates who figured out it was about us. But instead of the judgment we expected, several parents from the after-school program reached out with their own stories and resources. One mother dropped off a folder of senior services information she'd collected when dealing with her own mother-in-law. Another family offered to connect us with a lawyer who specialized in elder law. The support was overwhelming in the best way. That same week, Uncle called Dad at 2 a.m. crying so hard he could barely talk. He admitted he'd been secretly giving grandmother money when she called claiming she was starving. Annette had found the bank withdrawals and confronted him about breaking their agreement. Uncle said grandmother had called him sobbing that the rooming house food was making her sick, and she hadn't eaten in 3 days. He'd driven over with $200 cash without telling Annette. When Annette discovered what happened, she packed a bag and went to stay with her sister. Uncle was devastated and begged Dad to talk to her. Dad drove to Annette's sister's house the next morning and found her sitting on the porch with red eyes. She wasn't mad about the money, but about the lying and going behind her back after everything they'd agreed on. It took Uncle showing up with flowers and a written promise to never hide financial decisions again before she'd even consider coming home. They spent the next month in couples counseling working through the trust issues grandmother had created between them. Meanwhile, Stephanie had been working on getting grandmother into the senior center meal program. The center served hot lunches 5 days a week and had a food pantry for weekends. Grandmother qualified based on her income and could eat there for free. The first day she showed up 40 minutes late claiming she got lost even though the center was 3 blocks from her rooming house. She sat at a table with 3 other women and immediately started telling them how her rich sons abandoned her. One woman called her out saying she'd heard grandmother had family dropping off groceries every week. Grandmother changed her story to say the groceries were mostly expired food they didn't want. But over the weeks, she actually started making friends with a group that played cards after lunch. Stephanie reported that grandmother was showing up regularly and even helping set up chairs some days. A month into this new routine, I was doing homework when Dad's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The hospital was calling to say grandmother had fallen at the rooming house and was treated for a sprained wrist and bruised ribs. The other residents said she'd been reaching for something on a high shelf and lost her balance. Dad sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes staring at his phone before deciding what to do. He called Mom at the after-school program, and they agreed to visit, but with strict boundaries. They'd stay for 30 minutes maximum, and I had to come as a buffer. We found grandmother in a hospital bed looking smaller than I'd ever seen her with her wrist wrapped and an IV in her arm. She started crying the second she saw us saying how scared she'd been, and how none of the nurses would listen to her. Mom checked with the nurses, who said grandmother had been demanding a private room and refusing the prescribed pain medication because she wanted something stronger. Dad told her firmly that we were there to make sure she was okay, but not to take her home with us. Grandmother tried saying she couldn't go back to the rooming house with her injuries, but the doctor came in and explained she'd be fine with some physical therapy. Stephanie worked with Medicare to get the therapy covered and arranged for a medical transport to take grandmother to appointments. The doctor also prescribed a walker, which made grandmother's face turn red. She insisted she didn't need it, and it would make her look like an old lady. Dad actually laughed at that. Not mean, but genuinely amused that she was worried about appearances while living in a rooming house. The walker turned out to be necessary because grandmother's balance was worse than she admitted. 3 families who had threatened to leave our after-school program after the scene grandmother caused decided to stay after hearing how we were handling everything. One mother pulled Mom aside and shared how her mother-in-law had lived with them for 2 years and nearly destroyed her marriage. She said seeing us maintain boundaries while still ensuring grandmother's basic needs were met gave her hope that families could survive these situations. The program actually grew stronger, with parents supporting each other through difficult family dynamics. Stephanie signed grandmother up for mandatory budgeting classes at the senior center as part of her assistance requirements. Grandmother complained the entire first session, but the instructor called later to say she'd actually participated and even helped another attendee figure out percentages. By the 3rd week, grandmother was showing up early and had made friends with a man who was learning to manage his Social Security checks. 2 months into the arrangement, Officer Dion knocked on our door looking embarrassed. He'd caught grandmother going through our trash cans at 5 in the morning looking for bottles to recycle. She'd told him we threw away valuable recyclables and she needed the money for medicine. Dad's face went white when Officer Dion explained he had to issue an official warning for trespassing. We walked outside to find grandmother sitting in the patrol car with a garbage bag full of cans. Dad realized she was genuinely struggling with poverty for the first time after years of spending other people's money freely. Officer Dion suggested we put our recycling directly in the rooming house's bins if we wanted to help without enabling the trespassing. As the 3-month rooming house payment deadline approached, we organized a family meeting at a neutral location. Uncle and Annette drove up together, their first joint appearance since the money incident. We met at a coffee shop downtown where grandmother couldn't accidentally show up. Annette surprised everyone by offering to continue paying for the rooming house if grandmother met specific conditions. She had to keep attending budgeting classes, stop manipulating other residents for money, and agree to monthly check-ins with Stephanie. Uncle added that any violation would mean immediate termination of support. Dad suggested we put everything in writing this time to avoid future misunderstandings. Something happened that none of us expected. Grandmother's knees buckled and she collapsed onto our porch, sobbing harder than I'd ever seen anyone cry. Not the fake tears from before, but actual body-shaking sobs that made her whole frame shake. She grabbed onto the porch railing and pulled herself up enough to look at Dad, her face red and blotchy. "I'm scared," she said between gasps. "I've never had to worry about money before and I don't know what to do." Dad's face changed slightly, his jaw unclenching just a bit. Mom put her hand on his arm, and they had one of those silent conversations married people have. Finally, Mom went inside and came back with Stephanie's business card. She handed it to grandmother and said Stephanie could help her apply for senior housing and other benefits. Grandmother took the card with shaking hands and actually said thank you, which was probably the first genuine thank you she'd given in years. Over the next few weeks, Stephanie worked with grandmother to fill out applications for every senior housing complex in the county. The waiting lists were all 4 to 6 months long, but the rooming house manager agreed to keep her month to month as long as the payments kept coming, and she stopped causing problems with other residents. Meanwhile, at the school, Logan noticed I was struggling to focus and asked me to stay after class. He helped me start writing my college application essays, and one of them ended up being about learning to set boundaries with toxic family members. He read my first draft and told me my ability to handle such a complicated situation at my age showed real maturity. I worked on that essay for weeks, writing about watching my parents build something from nothing, while my grandmother chose money over family. Logan helped me shape it into something that showed growth without sounding bitter. Around the same time, grandmother started showing up at the senior center more regularly. The coordinator there needed help in the thrift shop 2 days a week, just sorting donations and pricing items. It only paid a small stipend, but gave grandmother something to do besides complain. She still grumbled about the work being beneath her, but she showed up on time and did the job. One afternoon when I was helping Mom at the after-school program, 5 new families showed up to register their kids. One of the mothers pulled Mom aside and said she'd heard about how we handled the situation with my grandmother, maintaining boundaries while still making sure she had basic needs met. She said it inspired her to deal with her own difficult mother-in-law in a healthier way. Mom's eyes got watery and she had to excuse herself to the bathroom for a minute. The program kept growing after that, and we had to hire another part-time helper just to manage all the new kids. Uncle called Dad more often now, and they started meeting for coffee every week at the diner downtown. They had a rule that they couldn't talk about grandmother during these meetings, just catching up on work and life. Dad came home from these meetings looking lighter somehow, like a weight he'd been carrying for years was finally lifting. Uncle told Dad that he and Annette had started seeing a couples therapist to work through the damage grandmother's manipulation had caused in their marriage. Annette had forgiven him for giving grandmother money behind her back, but they both wanted to make sure they communicated better going forward. The therapist helped them set up new rules about financial decisions and family boundaries. 4 months passed with grandmother staying in the rooming house, going to her thrift shop job, and attending the senior center activities. Then Stephanie called with news that grandmother had been approved for a subsidized senior apartment. The rent would be based on her small social security check, and she could move in the next week. Despite everything, we all showed up to help her move. Dad rented a small truck, Uncle brought boxes, and even Annette came to help pack. Grandmother didn't thank anyone directly, but for once she didn't complain either. She just quietly packed her few belongings and let us load them into the truck. The senior apartment building was actually nice, with a community room and weekly activities. As we carried boxes up to her second-floor unit, I noticed other residents watching from their doorways. One woman about grandmother's age introduced herself and mentioned she also had a complicated relationship with her kids. Within a week, grandmother and this woman were playing cards together in the community room every afternoon, complaining about their families to each other. Dad said it was probably therapeutic for everyone involved. The senior center coordinator called Stephanie with an opportunity a few weeks after grandmother moved in. They needed someone to help with their meal program, setting up tables and serving food 3 days a week. It was a real paid position, not just a stipend, though still part-time. Grandmother accepted the job grudgingly, acting like she was doing them a favor, but Stephanie later told us she was actually one of their most reliable workers. She showed up early, stayed late to help clean, and even started remembering the regular attendees' names and dietary restrictions. Stephanie said in her 20 years of social work, this was some of the best progress she'd seen in a similar situation. 6 months crawled by with grandmother keeping to her routine at the senior apartment. She woke up at 7 every morning to walk to the senior center for breakfast duty. She served eggs and toast to the other residents 3 days a week. The coordinator paid her every 2 weeks, and she used the money for groceries and bus fare. She never called to apologize for calling me a disgrace when I was born. She never said sorry for choosing money over family. But she also stopped showing up at our door unannounced. She stopped calling Dad's work phone during his shifts. She stopped telling sob stories to strangers about her ungrateful children. Mom and Dad threw themselves back into the after-school program once the drama settled down. They spent weekends planning the expansion they'd been dreaming about for years. Jay Swift remembered our story and helped them apply for a community development grant. The application took them 3 weeks to complete with all the paperwork and references required. 2 months later, the grant came through for $40,000. They found a perfect location on the north side of town where no programs existed. Dad spent every weekend that summer renovating the space with volunteer help. Mom interviewed and hired 2 new staff members to help with the increased enrollment. By September, they had 75 kids showing up across all 3 locations. Parents started calling it the best thing that ever happened to their neighborhood. The local news did a segment showing kids learning to change oil and solve algebra problems side by side. I spent my senior year focusing on college applications while everything else stabilized. My grades were good enough for several schools to show interest. The guidance counselor helped me apply for every scholarship we could find. In March, the acceptance letter came from State University, with a partial scholarship covering half the tuition. Mom cried when she read it, and Dad picked me up and spun me around the kitchen. 2 days later, a card arrived addressed to me with no return address. Inside was a $5 bill and a note in shaky handwriting saying she was proud. Dad laughed when he saw it and said it was probably the first money she'd given anyone in years. Mom carefully put the card in my memory box anyway. Uncle called the next week with news that made everyone stop what they were doing. Annette was pregnant and due in the fall. They'd been trying for 2 years and had almost given up hope. During the call, Uncle made it clear that grandmother would have supervised visits only. No babysitting, no alone time with the baby, no showing up uninvited. When they told grandmother at the senior center, she just nodded without arguing. She understood she had no leverage to demand anything more. My graduation day arrived faster than anyone expected. The ceremony was held in the high school football stadium on a perfect June morning. Mom insisted on inviting grandmother even though Dad thought it was unnecessary. She showed up 30 minutes early and found a seat in the back row. She wore the same dress she'd worn to every family event for the past 6 months. When they called my name, I saw her sitting there quietly. She didn't cheer or wave like the other grandparents. She just watched and then left right after, without trying to come to our celebration dinner. Mom said later it was probably the best outcome we could hope for. 2 weeks after graduation, the after-school program won a Community Excellence Award. The ceremony was held at City Hall with the mayor presenting the trophy. Dad had to give a speech about their journey and what the program meant to the community. He thanked everyone who supported them through difficult times without naming any specifics. I sat in the 3rd row and watched him scan the audience. His eyes landed on grandmother sitting near the back in her usual spot. Something shifted in his face, and for the first time I saw peace there. He finished his speech talking about how family comes in many forms. The audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted 3 minutes. Grandmother slipped out during the applause, but not before I caught her wiping her eyes. She kept living in her senior apartment with her benefits and part-time work. She showed up to holiday dinners when invited, but always left before dessert. She came to Uncle's house once a month to see the baby with Annette supervising every minute. She never held the baby without someone else's hands nearby. She never complained about the restrictions or tried to push boundaries. She wasn't the loving grandmother kids dream about. She wasn't even particularly nice most of the time. But she also wasn't the destructive hurricane she'd been before. August came and I started packing for college. My room looked strange with half my stuff in boxes and suitcases. That evening we decided to swim in the pool one last time before I left. The water was perfect, and the sunset painted everything gold. Dad floated on his back and mentioned his mother was doing okay at the senior center. Mom and I just nodded because we all knew this messy solution was the best we'd get. Well, that's gonna wrap it up for me today. Kinda makes you stop and think about things, huh? Appreciate you hanging out and wondering through it all with me. Subscribe for more content like this.